Good morning, and again, following on from my previous colleague, we looked forward to having this throne speech delivered this year, and we do have an ambitious agenda that has been included in this throne speech. And obviously, I'm going to speak to those issues that directly impact the Home Affairs Ministry, and looking for how we can enhance the quality of life for our people. So you will note that in the throne speech, we looked at how can we strengthen our families and extend the principle of equality and fairness in the workplace. Now, what we looked to do, it indicated that the government will study the matter of parental leave to include maternity, paternity, and adoption leave. And you might ask, well, why is this coming under Home Affairs? Well, we do have things that impact on labor, and therefore we have the Labor Advisory Council, which actually is the nucleus of the department in dealing with labor issues. So this is an issue that will be put to the Labor Advisory Council. We will confirm the structure around which they will be operating in this regard and the terms of reference so that we can have these discussions in a meaningful way. I think it's very important from a social perspective to strengthen the family structure and to make sure that we have systems in place where people can feel comfortable, that if they require time off, that it's structured and that it is supported by government policies. So that's something that will be explored on a very in-depth and detailed manner in order to be able to accomplish that. The other thing that we have to make sure of is that our young people, that our children are not disadvantaged because one parent or another fails to meet its parental obligations. And so, of course, we need to ensure that our children have the best possible opportunities with the parents taking responsibility for their children. We also have within the Ministry of Home Affairs the Department of Workforce Development, and you will know that we have had a requirement. It's been brought into legislation quite a few years ago. Actually, in 2004, we had the National Occupational Certification Act, which included skills and competencies that were required for current and future construction projects. What we have done is to actually enhance what happens within the Department of Workforce Development to ensure that we have national certification. So for specific industries, in order for somebody to be able to hold themselves out as competent in a particular area, they are required to have certification. So what will happen is that in order for anybody to get a job in those particular areas, and specifically I'm going to speak to electrical, and I'm also going to speak to I'm totally missing it here. There's another one that I wanted to speak of. It'll come in a moment. But in these particular areas, what will happen is that in order to be able to be certified, we will have the standards, we will have conditions set, we will have a curriculum set so that people coming into, and it's landscaping is the other one that I wanted to think about, but when we wanted to, in order to qualify and to be certified, you will have to be able to satisfy the terms and conditions of the curriculum. And then once that certification is obtained, then those people will be deemed to be competent. With those competencies, then consumers will be able to satisfy themselves that they are getting a quality person to do a quality job. What's interesting with that is that there are times that a lot of those areas require work permits. And obviously, as a government, looking out for the employment of our people, it's important that we ensure that as many Bermudians as possible are able to get jobs in their country. So in terms of looking at work permits for specific industries, we will be minimizing the work permits that are issued as much as we possibly can to be able to enhance the ability of Bermudians to be able to be employed. And in so doing, looking at that, we will ensure that if somebody is coming in and requires a work permit in the absence of the ability of a Bermudian to fill that job, we will make sure that that person also has the national standard certification before they are able to apply for a work permit. What will happen is that the Department of Immigration will be working in lockstep with the Department of Workforce Development to ensure that even before a permit is applied for, that the applicant has met the standards that will be set out by the curriculum and by the certification process. So I think that's something new that I think historically we kind of had people coming in and there was really no real measure to say that this is a prerequisite before you can get a work permit. Well, now the Department of Immigration will be working in lockstep with the Department of Workforce Development to ensure that that system is put in place. And I think that also, by having a set curriculum, having a training officer to ensure that the standards are set, and then to have enforcement officers, that helps to ensure that our Bermudians also qualify at a level that may minimize the necessity for work permits to be issued. And I think I'm looking forward to that. Just anything that will help us to ensure that our people are put back to work and that they do that effectively, efficiently, and trustworthily, so that a consumer can know that if I call an individual, that person is certified and qualified to do the job. That has got to be the ultimate aim, and that also enhances what happens with respect to our people being put back to work. We also are looking through this period of time, you will know that we had a consultative group to look at immigration reforms, and we've had some challenges the early part of the year. And what had happened coming out of some of those challenges and questions that the populace had of the government is to make sure that we methodically went through the immigration processes, and that whatever was put to the public was going to be something where it was able to be embraced by the public. So we have the Immigration Reform Working Group that was formed as a result of the March differences of opinion that existed. They have worked assiduously, and they had the obligation to look at how they would handle adoption. First of all, they did that bit in their negotiations. They actually brought legislation to Parliament, and we've passed that legislation. So if you're talking about adopted children, that matter has been resolved. They are now working on the issue with respect to mixed status families, and those negotiations, they're actually going, those discussions have taken to the public airwaves and public venues. So they have had town hall meetings, and the most recent of those were last week, in which the public had the opportunity to give their input, their thoughts and ideas as to how we address the issue of mixed status families. And this is a situation where you may have one child who has the right to have Bermudian status, another sibling may not, or a parent and a child, you have those differentials. And obviously the whole situation with respect to immigration and immigration reform is always a vexatious issue, and we have to be able to approach it and address it in a sensitive kind of way. So using the Reform Committee, the Consultative Immigration Reform Working Group, they have been driving these initiatives obviously with support from the government. They report to us on a weekly basis, so I'm always in the loop in terms of the progress that they are making. One of the other things that they will be looking at as part of the original agreement that came out of their being set up in the first place was to look at the issue respecting PRCs, that's permanent resident certificates, as well as granting a Bermudian status for long-term residents who have been here for over X periods of time. They have not reached that stage of the negotiations as yet, so there's nothing that I can report to you to say that this is the stage at this moment, but what I can say is that they are continuing to work on it. They will give recommendations. I do know that in the original legislation that was tabled in March, that there were recommendations, there were conditions that were put in that legislation. That has actually been taken away, and the reform group will be looking at it, and they will come back with recommendations. So to say, would it be X number of years, or would it be, that somebody is here for PRC, will a PRC get status, will status, be obtained after a certain period of time? All of that is still to be negotiated. It's still to be put to the public, and we're still having that feedback before their final recommendations are made. So we're not quite there, but that is part of what will happen, because with their recommendations, recommendations, we will have their recommendations either looked at and assumed within the legislative process so that we can have legislation that would reflect what is appropriate coming out of those negotiations. So that's one of the things that we're going to do. And then another issue that we're looking at is to amend the Rent Increases Domestic Premises Control Act. And what that will do, we have to look at striking a balance between rent control, the rights of tenants, and the need to ensure that there's a fair economic return for landlords. And I think what seems to have happened thus far is that some of the issues may have been skewed. And I think if you're a landlord, you think that I've been, left hanging out to dry. If you're a tenant, you're thinking there's no protection. And I think the importance is to make sure that we liaise and coalesce around the issue so that ultimately we have a policy and legislation that is appropriate in those circumstances. So I think those are the major areas that we are looking at. Obviously, we'll have some new legislative guidelines around trademarks, patents, and designs that will be able to bring our standards in line with international standards, and that's being worked on by the Registrar General, Mr. Pennyman, and so we will be looking at his recommendations for legislative changes to be able to embrace those in the construct of the legislation that we provide during the course of this upcoming year. So it's ambitious, but we are quite excited about the work that we are required to do to enhance the lives of Bermudians.
Open up to the floor.
Was the debt collection situation on your docket too?
Well, it's interesting with debt collection. It's we're talking about having cross-ministry responsibilities because you have to look at where, I don't have anything in my legislation respecting debt collection. Sorry, wait a minute. I'm just being. Hang on. Let me just get here.
Just before the copyright.
Yeah, just give me 1 second. In terms of the time that collection calls can be made and that sort of stuff, that's what we put on.
After debt collectors are not doing it properly.
Well, in terms of the times that the debt collectors can go and be able to approach people and knock on doors and things like that, yes, that obviously will come under our remit. I thought you meant in terms of, whether we're going to be the ones taking people to court for debt collection stuff, which comes under a different ministry. Sorry, I did miss that highlight. But, I think that what we want to be able to accomplish as a government is a community and a society where we can live together, work together in harmonious relationship. And I think there are things that happen that perhaps are not quite as balanced as they might be, and we want to make sure and put these things in balance. So nobody wants anybody knocking on your door at midnight or calling you in the middle of a Sunday church service to say, I'm calling you and you didn't pay your bill and you were supposed to come here with your $50 or whatever. We don't want that. So we want to make sure that there are rules and regulations surrounding how people can make those collections and make it appropriate.
You must have had anecdotal information.
We certainly have had.
I'm just going to remind you to please speak in the mic.
Any questions at all? Minister, I just want some clarity on the certification scheme, especially when it concerns work permits holders. Clearly, when an employer applies for a work permit, they already think that person is qualified. What checks are going to be done exactly to make sure that they do have is it going to be an equivalence type of comparison of their qualifications with what we require, or do they have to come to Bermuda and actually get the national certification? Is that?
Well, ideally, when somebody makes an application for a job, they will be able to indicate what their qualifications are. That is a prerequisite. So you apply for a job, you have to know that at least you have certain competencies in order to have that job. We have, excuse me. So that's a given that if you're making an application that you ought to be qualified. However, a qualification or certification that you might have in your jurisdiction may not be standardized with what we expect for our jurisdiction. So when somebody comes in and they say that I have gotten X certificate wherever I live, they will make sure that they will be able to go to the workforce development to make sure that what the curriculum requires, that they have met those competencies. That will be determined before the application is able to come to the board for the board to be able to opine on whether it's appropriate to give that certification. And I just wanted to highlight that there were two other categories as well. It was landscape gardeners and electricians, which I mentioned earlier. There was also auto mechanics and welders who will also form a part of that category.
So I'm just trying to understand why that work can't be done in advance, because in most countries, Western developed countries anyway, there are standard professional qualifications for things like electricians, etc. So can't we just in advance figure out which ones are equivalent to the national certification? Makes it easier for people applying for work permits, doesn't it?
That does, and I take your point. Here's where here's what the situation is that at the moment we did not have what those standards were. We're now putting those standards in place. Obviously, as an initial exercise, we want to make sure that the standards are there so anybody applying will be able to meet those standards. The look at equivalency is going to be step 2, so that we will know that before anybody comes, it's like, don't even bother to go make an application, because if your hometown qualification doesn't meet the standards that are set out by the Bermuda legislation. That's the key. I think the National Training Board have worked assiduously on this particular issue. They have, we've identified the individual that will put forward the curriculum to ensure that these areas are dealt with and that the requirements are standardized. And then once we get through the initial blush of making sure that that the process is working well, then obviously we can look at making it a little bit more comfortable, I guess, easier before somebody comes, when they make their applications. What is the level of equivalence? Those are things that will come in time, but you have to actually set your nucleus and set your standards initially, and that's what we're in the process of doing.
All right, final question. You mentioned that this legislation has been in place for a while now. Your government has been around for 4 years. Why is it taking so long to protect Bermudians' interests, Les?
Why is it taking so long to
put this thing in place?
Well, let's just say that it has been put in place, but not in as formal a way as it ought to be. The National Training Board have set out the wish list, as it were, and obviously we have not had the personnel, we had some challenges in that respect, to make sure that the system is put in place properly. Now we've made that commitment to doing so. Bear in mind that when you have policies that come or legislation that's required, there are times when it takes a little while for it to be up and running and to get all the tweaks and all of the challenges worked through. The National Training Board, under the chairmanship of Jeff Souza, has done an absolute yeoman job. They put out the National Training Plan Part 1. National Training Plan Part 2 is ready to go, which they will be putting out very shortly. There were some tweaks that were required to be made so that we can ensure that we didn't have a plan that had, let's say, as an example, financial implications without ensuring that the finance ministry were on board with things like that. So when you have an independent committee working, you can obviously look at wish lists and then see how we can accommodate those wish lists in the construct of what we are, what we have to do in government. So we're working on those things. And obviously, it's easier to say, oh, that's been in place and you could have done it. But I believe that at times it's a little bit better to just pause and do something well than to do it just because. And I would like to ensure that at the end of this process, it is done well, that Bermudians are not disadvantaged, that they will have the opportunity to be certified with an acceptable qualifying standard, and that in the absence of Bermudians, and I stress, in the absence of available Bermudians, we will then have the opportunity for foreigners to be able to apply for those jobs.
Jasmine?
Good morning. In terms of collecting arrears for child maintenance, how much is approximately owed? Do you know?
That I don't know. That's a situation that I think the Justice Department will probably have a better handle on, and certainly the Finance Ministry would be able to respond a little bit better, probably even the Justice Ministry, but I don't have a handle on the amounts.
Okay. Whilst you can't comment specifically on individual immigration cases, how long does the immigration appeals process normally take?
It depends on what is being appealed. Obviously, you have the Immigration Appeals Tribunal, which sits on certain immigration issues. You have some issues that will come to the minister for appeal, and you may have certain processes that may have to come back to the minister. So it's all very subjective. And as I said, you can't specifically mention cases, but those are the avenues that are available.
And with the idea of stricter rent controls, etc., was this sort of introduced because of the America's Cup coming up next year?
No, I think the Consumer Affairs Bureau have been looking at this legislation and how to enhance protections for both landlords and tenants, and this is working through that process. Certainly, America's Cup coming up next year may have heightened the awareness of some of the issues that may have arisen, but I don't think this legislation is not geared towards any one particular event.
On the subject of qualifications and work permits, is this being brought forward because work permit applications have been put in for people who do not have Bermudian level qualifications?
No, what's happened is that what we haven't been able to do is to capture historically the fact that this person's qualification is appropriately standardized to what will be required. And I think that in the absence of having that curriculum to say that this is what we require, your qualification that you got from wherever is equivalent, then we just want to make sure that that's the reason it was put in place. And we just want to make sure that people who are coming in, that there is no ability for them to slip in. If I'm an accountant, I'm not going to apply for a job as a landscaper if I've had no landscaping experience, just because, somebody might like the idea that, I may be reasonably intelligent enough to do something like that. So it's not being done, it's being done to make sure that our systems are standardized and that anybody who's applying, Bermudians and foreigners, meet those qualification standards. That's the intent.
Now, just springboarding off the immigration appeals issue, your predecessor had promised that appeal tribunal decisions be published online. We've not had a single appeal decision published since August of last year. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, is there any reason why there's a backlog? Or ultimately, have there been no meetings?
I was just going to say, I have no clue if there are any outstanding. If there's something that's outstanding, if an appeal has to go to the Immigration Appeals Tribunal, it would have been referred and it would have been dealt with. And if the rule is that it's put online, then it would have been put online. It's quite possible there have been none.
All right. And the final question would be, we've heard some complaints regarding the time it takes to process the status applications and work permit applications. Mm-hmm. Is there anything being done to expedite the process?
Well, let's just say that when I came into the ministry, one of the things that we tried to do was to get a handle on the workload that was required. Now that has been assessed, we are able now to measure what is able to be done, what can be completed in any given time frame. I think there have been delays in processing certain things. We have put measures in place in order to create efficiencies within the department. So we're looking at bettering the interaction between the department and the public so that everybody's happy at the end of the day. And we want the work done.
Finally, could you give us an update on the unemployment situation? Is there a trend? Have we shown any changes in the last year?
I don't know statistically. Those are things that I would have a better handle on when we get to budget time, because those are the things that we kind of focus on during that period of time. Anecdotally, there have been some job losses in certain industries. Whether those people have been able to be absorbed in other areas, I'm not 100% certain. Obviously, when I look at the work permit applications that come through, there may have been a slightly different approach in dealing with work permit applications, and that is to scrutinize them extremely intensely to make sure that what is being asked for is not able to be provided from our local workforce. So we've been very, very astute on that.
The upkick in tourism, the upkick in construction work, I just wondered if there had been any commensurate increase in jobs for Bermudians.
I'm sorry.
So we've had an upkick in tourism, and we had an upkick in construction over the last 6 or 7 months. Has there been any definitive signs of increased jobs for Bermudians?
I would think yes. In fact, I do know that the Morgan's Point construction is ongoing, and they have a significant number of Bermudians working up on that site. I know there have been some specific other projects, and obviously we have ready for shovels in the ground in short order, hopefully, the East End Hotel and things like that. So we will definitely start to see the fruits of the labor for the things that we've looked to bring down the pipeline. Yeah. Yeah. Let me just a note. Okay. So this is I've just been reminded with respect to the workforce development and then the assessment of capable Bermudians, eligible Bermudians. So the process would be that they'll go to the Department of Workforce Development first, and they will assess and then identify whether there are any Bermudians. We do have within the Department of Workforce Development the job board. So, and it's an extremely important tool that if people are looking for work, they can actually go to job board, determine what jobs are on offer, and put their resumes out. What's also very interesting with that is that whenever a work permit application comes to the department for consideration, attached to that work permit application has to be the results of the job board search. So it's important for people to utilize job board for their best advantage. So then after the electricians and welders, which is, this process is already in place. So they'll go to workforce development. They will be assessed, and then they will identify if any Bermudians are available. They will then come to the immigration department. So it goes to workforce development first, then they come to the immigration department. And then the act requires that they will have 3 months within which to apply, and then that will be a condition on their work permit. So in other words, if for whatever reason they come, we have to make sure that the certification is appropriate, and that will be a condition of their work permit. So if you don't get it, you won't work.
You'll have to leave.
If you don't get the certification, and which speaks to your point earlier, that ideally this is done on the front end so that you don't have somebody moving in and then finding that you can't qualify. But until we get the entire process in place and make sure that it's working smoothly, we will say to somebody, if you haven't got it, I'm sorry, you can't stay in this job. That will be a condition of your work permit. And that's the way that works.